Welcome to the WriterDojo with your host, Steve Diamond
That's me.
and Larry Correa.
Hey guys!
This week, dialogue.
All right, everybody, welcome to the WriterDojo. Today, Larry and I want to talk about something that we both love writing, and we have some pretty strong opinions about it, and that's dialogue.
Oh yeah.
So, one of the things that, and I specifically know this, I started really paying attention to this when I would hear my wife talk about what she liked reading. My wife, she likes mysteries and thrillers primarily. That's kind of her bread and butter. That's where she finds her, like, kind of her most comfort when she reads. And the one thing, at one point I watched, in fact, this happened recently, I watched her pick up probably 4 different books, and within 3 pages, she'd put them all down. And then she found one that she liked, and she's been reading it, and she's about halfway through the book now. And I asked her, I said, well, and this isn't new. I always ask her, I'm like, oh, well, why did you put down that book? Why did you put down that book? Because as an author, I care. I want to know. I want to know why someone might be putting down my book.
Good indicator.
And almost every time she says, I hate the dialogue in this book. And specifically, there's not enough dialogue in this book.
Interesting.
And, she was a big James Patterson reader for a while, back before he turned into the James Patterson Book of the Month Club.
I think he just has a bunch of dudes chained in his basement.
He totally does. Him and Nora Roberts, they're probably the same person. So dialogue, Larry, when I talk with people about your book specifically, I pretty much mention every time action, of course. You're kind of known as an action guy. But I also mention how crisp your dialogue is.
I really enjoy writing dialogue. To me, dialogue is one of my favorite parts, and it's the part that I feel like I'm pretty good at, and I enjoy it. Boy, I have a lot to say about dialogue, and what really, really helped me with dialogue as a writer was listening to audiobooks. Specifically my own audiobooks, because I would go back and I would reread or listen before I would continue the next book in the series. I go back and listen to old audiobooks. And it was fascinating to hear a narrator's take on my writing and my dialogue. And what I discovered as I was listening is that, first off, dialogue tags, for the most part, are completely unnecessary. Or not completely unnecessary, but often unnecessary.
Yeah, don't go full Cormac McCarthy on us.
But really, the other thing I learned is if you have dialogue that is easily differentiated between character to character, where it's pretty obvious who's saying what because of the context, all of a sudden, you don't need a lot of those tags. You can just have, you can tell who's speaking by how they speak and what they say. And we'll go into a lot of nuts and bolts on this one because this is one of my favorite topics.
Dialogue, I think, is like anything in writing. It's a skill, and I think that a lot of people just take it for granted. They figure that, oh well, it's just people talking.
It's people talking.
It's not hard. How hard is this?
I talk.
Except most people don't talk. I remember. I'm trying to remember who it was that told me this. One of the exercises they did, and what really helped them understand that that the dialogue that you put in books is not actually how people actually talk.
No, it's not. That's important.
And he went. I remember who it is. I'm not going to say his name on the air to protect the wicked. But he went to a bar, and he sat down, and what he did is he just recorded basically how people were talking. Which I'm pretty sure is illegal. Anyway, he was doing that, and what he noticed was how often people use filler words, or how often people, like I just did,
we do it here on the air while we're trying not to.
Yeah, or people have specific tendencies that they say, or they sniff a lot, like Larry and I always do.
It's allergy season.
Sorry,
people.
Guys. Or they'll intentionally mispronounce words, or how much actually of their speech isn't even verbal.
Well, if you look at like professional like politicians, even guys that they're paid to speak, it's their job to talk. and you look at the number of ums and anytime professional goes off of the teleprompter, they do it. It's a very human thing. However, if you put all that into your dialogue,
It's freaking unreadable.
it's horrible. All you got to do is look at an actual like verbatim transcript of somebody speaking and read it out loud, and it's horrible. It's just horrible. You would not want to read the dialogue of how people actually talk. So what we really do in dialogue is a streamlined version of it that cuts out the come on, man. You know, you cut out most. Now you can leave some of that stuff for affectation. Steve's like, gee, I wonder who I could be talking about there. No, but you put this stuff in sparingly. If I use in conversation, in dialogue, what I'm trying to indicate is that person is having like a moment, like that character's having a moment of stammering, of not knowing what to say. Or if I have somebody trail off stupidly, which we do all the time as human beings.
Oh, yeah.
But it's usually in fiction, it's for a purpose. It's to indicate a mood. So be very careful on the realistic talking. Also, the other one on that, too, is profanity.
Yeah.
If you wrote profanity like real, and I have a lot of profanity in my books.
Well, I remember you and I talking about this when you were writing Hard Magic.
Oh, I cut out.
And then again in
I cut out
Son of the Black Sword.
I cut out like, well, it's okay. That's actually, yeah. So we'll get to that in a sec, but because that was a strategic decision.
Yeah.
Okay, so but like in profanity in real life, you can use the F-bomb in a sentence as a noun, adjective, adverb, verb, preposition,
Like the scene in The Wire.
pronouns. That was one. Yeah, and I'm trying not to swear because of this podcast, right?
Yeah, we don't want the E-tag.
Yeah, no, we don't want that. But the thing is, when you're using profanity like that in a book, this is the secret people don't realize. Audio is not as bad, but in reading, when your brain is scanning down a page, you actually read the line you're reading, but your eyes are already seeing the line below, and you're still looking at the line above. So if you have an F-bomb in each of those lines, it's actually like you have 9 F-bombs, not 3.
Yeah, it's magnified.
It's magnified mentally. Whereas if you have 1, it's still like 3. So when you have a word, it's 3 times the power. That's also the same reason that we try to avoid repetitive word use, because repetitive word use on the page looks horrible.
Yeah.
Because once again, you're seeing it not 3 times in a paragraph. Their brain is seeing it 9 times, so it's magnified.
And you and I read for each other, as kind of alpha readers for each other. Though these days we're both pretty busy, so it's more like, hey Larry, check out this scene. Did I screw this up, or is it cool? Or you saying, hey Steve, I read this scene, make sure I'm not full of crap. But with the one thing that I think universally you and I point out to each other so hardcore is the repetitive word choice.
Yeah,
because we both do it in our drafts.
And it's interesting though, because in real life dialogue, people do it all the time. You say the same word over and over and over and over again in conversation. That's completely normal. But if you do it in a book, it looks unnatural. It feels unnatural. So that's a huge one. So that is one really to watch out for, guys. And the profanity, the power of profanity. That's why there's some like, I'm trying to remember the book, but there was one where they tried to do where it's like the salty Navy SEAL was profane. And yeah, I get what the guy was going for, but what's that whole 9 times power thing? Yeah. It was just unreadable. It got silly.
Yeah.
It just felt goofy, even though it might have been verbatim how the dude actually talked in real life.
Well, and honestly though, I mean, we both know the people that swear like crazy. And
yeah.
Well, I mean, you. But so much of that is contextual, and so much of that is knowing who that person is and kind of their personality and stuff. You can't assume that, especially early on in a novel. I mean, even several books into a series, you can't assume that the reader is going to understand contextually who that character is, and so oftentimes you don't have the freedom. You don't have the what's the word I'm looking for? Like the kind of the character bank account to really trust the author with using language as such.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Because you mentioned like the amount of profanity in Hard Magic, and I always do word count at the end. I'll do a Control F and go through and see how many times I use the word.
No pun intended. On Toru.
Oh, yeah. Well, Toru was a few, but there was Mahdi in the first book.
Yeah.
And I had like
that's
80 F-bombs from this one guy. And it was realistic for that character, but I think I cut those like in a quarter.
Oh, yeah.
Because you had to. And then Son of the Black Sword, I originally, the draft, I had regular earthly profanity in it, but then I actually changed that to be something specific for that world, because that made it more interesting for the dialogue. Boy, dialogue is really interesting. Another one that you got to avoid is when people try to write dialect and patois.
Patois, yeah.
Yeah, and so that's, for example, like say you're writing the Scotsman, the kilted Scotsman is the one I always see, and the guy will, everybody else will be talking normal English, and then this guy, ye lassie there can do, and it's like all these, can is CANNE and ye are lard, and it's like you can't read it. Yeah. And what happens, unfortunately, is your reader, they're, once again, this is going back to the reader psyche and reader brain. They're going down that page and they're reading English and they hit this unintelligible gibberish, and it throws them out of the book because they have to stop and shift gears to decipher the words that you put on the page. Even though they're nominally in English, you're trying to demonstrate that this dude has an accent, but you've written it like realistic pronunciation, and that just kills it for a reader. If you're going to use patois and messed up words in English, do so sparingly, just enough to indicate how that person talks. Don't go overboard. It'd be like having the narrator, your audiobook, doing an accent that none of the characters could, none of the listeners could understand. It would be horrible. But that's what people do all the time because they think they need to do that. Like, for whatever, because dwarves always speak Scottish.
Apparently.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
And Romans all have English accents. That's how it works. But don't be very careful with patois, guys.
One of the things that I see quite frequently is, and you alluded to this earlier, it's really hard for a lot of readers to accurately depict who the character is just through speaking. Now, when Larry and I, an interesting little thing here that happened fairly recently. Larry and I were kind of listening to the edited versions of a few of our first episodes, just to see how we were liking it, and for me to see how much I hated the sound of my own voice. And the funny thing is, when I got to Larry, I was listening to Larry and I'm like, oh yeah, that's Larry. Yep, he talks like this. Yep, he has those. And I could picture mannerisms when you were speaking, because we've known each other for a long time. And then it got to me and I was like, I don't know who the frick this guy is. This is weird. But so often it's hard for authors to, and look, every author is guilty of this to some degree because it's hard. And that's really giving unique voices to many, many characters. And I think this is why a lot of authors, myself included, and I love telling stories in first person, it gives me a little shortcut. I don't have to worry so much about the other people's voices all the time. I've got one primary voice.
Yeah.
But when you get into that kind of that third person narrative, you have so many characters to take care of. You have dialogue going back and forth. And like you said earlier, the fewer dialogue tags I have, the better.
Yeah, there's some tricks around that. Think about the character's personality. I like to put myself in their shoes when I'm writing them, and I think, how is this person going to present this? And a big part of it is sense of humor. Everybody's got a different sense of humor or lack thereof. So that's a huge part. If you establish how your characters laugh and what they think is funny, and you can get that in there, it's very indicative of who's talking. Anger. Some people are angrier than others. Some people are more determined than others. Some people are more religious than others. People have these different traits, but if you can accentuate those traits through their dialogue, it becomes clear who's speaking. Then there's the nuts and bolts tricks to avoid the seds. When I get done with a book, one of the first things I do a word search for, I said profanity. The other one is said.
Yeah.
And to give you an idea, my first novel, actually I did pretty good on this, but my first novel, I had like 500 seds in it. And then my most recent novel, I had like 100. Why? Because once again, going back to listening to audiobooks, all the unnecessary he said, she said, Bill said, Bob said, it is kind of grating to the ear. And it's unnecessary when you're listening to the audio. And so it looks like we're up on a break. We'll talk about the nuts and bolts trips because there's a lot of ways to avoid these things.
All right. So yeah, we'll be right back. We'll get more heavily into the nuts and bolts, and hopefully you will still love us after we probably bash on some of your favorite authors. And anyway, said Steve. The end.
In 1933 New York, magic comes in two varieties: the powerful sorcerers who use their abilities to acquire wealth and fame, and the Roomwrights who scratch out whatever living they can with their meager magic. Decidedly the latter category. Private Detective Alex Lockerbie uses his limited magic to catch criminals, finding evidence that's beyond the reach of the regular police. When a deadly magical plague is released in a Manhattan soup kitchen, Alex finds himself under suspicion. Now he has his book of runes, a pack of matches, and 4 days to find out where the plague came from, or the authorities will hang the crime squarely on him. In Plain Sight is the first book in Dan Willis's Arcane Casebook series. Readers looking for complex mysteries, well-developed magic with plenty of action, adventure, and suspense will find In Plain Sight to be just their slug of whiskey. In Plain Sight is available in all formats from Amazon and is free for Kindle Unlimited subscribers. Grab your copy today.
All right, everybody. Welcome back, said Steve. What we are going to do today for the rest of this session here is talk more about some of the nuts and bolts of dialogue and how you can get around a lot of the problems that Larry and I pointed out from the first half of the show. So Larry, let's talk specifically about what we can do to get rid of the word said where at all possible.
Yeah, and to be specific, you don't have to get rid of all of them. By anytime it's confusing as to who is speaking, then you need it.
Especially if there's more than two people talking.
Yeah, especially if you have like a conference room style meeting where there's 7 people.
Thank you, David Weber.
Yeah.
We love you.
If you have a David Weber style staff meeting, all right, and there's 15 named characters arguing over space tactics, okay, you're going to use a lot of sets. That said,
said Larry.
There are ways around this. Even if you only have 2 people talking, it's pretty easy to have the back and forth and to differentiate who is who. Every now and then, if you find that it's starting to get lost or your readers are getting confused, what you do is you drop in a said, or you do some sort of narrative descriptor of the person speaking. So it'd be like, quote, blah, 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 quote, Steve sniffed, or Steve pushed his glasses back on his face, or Steve stretched his shattered shoulder.
Yeah, there's been a lot of that today.
Or quote, or quote mark, blah, 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 end quote, Larry leaned back in his chair in a manly fashion and drank from his flavored soda.
Right. It's...
Yeah, you get what I'm saying, though.
Well, to go back to one of the things that I talked about before.
Oh, Steve does have a shattered shoulder.
And I do have a shoulder. Hey, I'm not in a sling now.
No.
At the time of recording this, I'm no longer in a sling. That doesn't mean I'm any more mobile. I still suck. Anyway, one of the things I mentioned before was the individual I mentioned that had gone to a bar and was recording people, how they were talking. It was how much nonverbal communication there is.
Oh, huge.
I mean, when Larry and I are together, I mean, shoot, half the things Larry just mentioned are personal tics that I have. I sniff a lot because I'm allergy boy, and Larry is also allergy boy.
It's bad right now.
We're allergy brothers, and I wear glasses, so I'm constantly adjusting them, and Larry always has a soda in hand, because true. That's Larry. I mean, shoot, half of the government contracts that we put together were fueled exclusively by Coke Zero.
Absolutely.
So what I like to do exactly what you just said. Rather than saying Joe said, I describe Joe doing something within the story and within the setting that seems relevant.
Yeah.
Sitting back or putting his, shaking his head and putting his hand on his forehead in, kind of an exasperation sort of a thing.
That's interesting. That's a paragraph structure thing too. This is something that a lot of people miss, especially when they're starting out. when you have what I like to do, especially in dialogue heavy scenes, is I'll have a paragraph only about the actions and words of one person. So like if somebody says something and I put some sort of clue in there as to who said it, I then start a new paragraph with the next person's reaction.
Yeah.
Don't ever put so-and-so said blah, blah, blah. Jimbo didn't like that very much. And then and it goes back to so-and-so. I'm going to put Jimbo in a separate paragraph. Because if I have Jimbo in the middle of so-and-so's paragraph, I should have named so-and-so. Jill and Jimbo.
Yes. Jilbo.
Yeah, Jilbo and Jimbo. So if I have Jilbo say something, Jimbo reacts, and then Jilbo says something else, it got confusing because I introduced Jimbo in the center of that paragraph, right? So I need to do a Jilbo paragraph, then a Jimbo paragraph, then a Jilbo paragraph. I'm going to have a character named Jilbo now, somewhere. Jilbo Baggins.
That's fantastic.
The Shire is in Alabama.
Oh, no. Oh, no. Tom Stranger just got a new sidekick.
Oh, no.
Jilbo Baggins.
Oh, great. So now when hobbits show up in
Tom Stranger
except they'll be
6?
called halflings specifically to be kept from being sued by the Tolkien estate.
Yeah. So when we're going through dialogue and we're seeing all of these different characters and stuff, I've always found that you can often tell who the character is just by quirks in their dialogue. I remember hearing Joe Lansdale, who I'm a big fan of.
Yeah, very, very talented.
I remember, I think it was on Facebook or something, naming the social media platform that should not be named. And I remember him saying something to the effect of, while he doesn't use patois, as we've said, he will say, he's like, you know what? Sometimes what I like to do is just a little thing. Like there's a character that always uses the incorrect word in their speech.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we always say like, oh, you should never use the word ain't. That's a stupid word.
Not used in dialogue all the time. Yeah.
But if you always have a character that's just the way they talk, that person always says, well, yeah, ain't, or they always use some weird contraction that doesn't exist or whatever. I've always found that using little shortcuts like that really helps make it easier for the character or for the readers to determine who that character is talking.
Yeah, that
who it
does
is.
help.
Especially if you do it in small amounts, not going super overboard.
Yeah, if you do it super overboard, then it gets old. There's formality too. It's like how much formality the person has in their speech. A big one is if they use their sirs and ma'ams. Another one is slang. The character will use more slang or less slang. A lot of times you can make it very obvious. And think about it too. This is more of a skilled thing. You'll get better as you go on. But age. Young people talk different than old people, and part of it, especially if you're writing in the modern world, a young person is going to use different slang than an old person, depending on when you came of age. Like I said, we're Gen Xers. We're in here. Everything is cool and everything is awesome. Yeah. That's usually what you see out of guys in their 40s.
Yeah, that's me.
We're the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle generation or whatever.
That's right. I mean, we're not saying cowabunga anymore, but thank heavens.
Yeah, don't have a cow, man. No, but that's what. And what we didn't bring up is dialogue tags other than said. And some writers, some people get very, very. It's a freaking religious dogma into itself. Well, it's funny because
thou shalt not use any other word than said.
Well, that's one of Elmore Leonard's rules, right? Mm-hmm. And I like Elmore Leonard. All right, but I disagree with him 100% on this one.
Well, I mean, I think it's like a list of 10 rules that you always see floating around on the internet.
And
I
violate
all of them except one.
I think I violate like 8 or 9 routinely.
Yeah. The one that's good is like get rid of all the crap that no one cares about.
That's my favorite one.
That's the good one.
Skip the parts that people skim anyway. That said, again, wow.
Said Larry.
Yeah, said Larry. People will be like, they'll use other dialogue tags like he shouted, he cried, he whined. I'm fine with those. I think if they're descriptive and they work and they convey the emotion of the sentence, they work great.
Yeah, sometimes I think the the anti-religious dogma or whatever you want to call it to that is, well, you should be explaining that just through the context of the sentence, or explain it in how they do things.
Yeah,
And
but
look, that's cool. That's fine.
That's cool and all, but it's also kind of boring.
But sometimes I just want to get to the next line.
Well, why do I want to arbitrarily pull a tool out of my toolbox? You
Right.
know, it's just a tool in my toolbox. I don't want to overuse it, just like I don't want to overuse anything. It's like if you have a piano with all these keys on it, and you only play one key over and over and over again, it's going to be horrible.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to sound awful. But if you play all the keys, you can make beautiful music.
Well, it's just a matter of practicing and understanding which ones you're better at than others.
Yeah. Now, there's some dialogue tags that I will never use. Like the one that I laugh at is ejaculated.
Ejaculated.
That's the one.
Yeah. I mean, it was used so often in the past.
Yeah, blah,
mean-
blah, blah, Jilbo ejaculated. Yeah, that one you probably haven't been able to really use since like the 1950s sci-fi, you know? That was probably when that kind of went out. And there's probably some other ones we're not thinking of that are a little dated. But for the most part, I think that other dialogue tags are fine as long as you're used sparingly. But that's where you get into the repetitive word usage.
Yeah.
Which if you write a lot of Sean Connery there for a second. Action scenes. If you write a lot of action scenes, the ones you got to watch out for are shouted, yelled, screamed, bellowed.
Yeah.
Because if you're writing stuff with like a lot of big explosions and loud noises going on, people are not having conversational tones during this.
Yeah. Well, and quite honestly, in a lot of the situations, and people are super adverse to this in terms of punctuation. They're like, don't ever use exclamation points.
Oh man,
how many times have you heard that, Larry?
All the time. I've had people tell me that for years. You should only have 2 or 3 exclamation points in a book. It's like, dude,
it's like, how much action do you write?
I
Come
write
on.
action scenes. The running joke about my books is if I write 20 or 30,000 words and nothing has exploded, a single bead of sweat will roll down my forehead, right? Because I'm nervous.
It's true. I've seen it happen.
Yeah, I mean, so I have to have action scenes. I have, 5 or 6 action scenes per book at least, if not more.
Big action.
And some
scenes.
action scenes, like my record, I think is, I still think it's like the 5-chapter fight scene at the end of Hard Magic is still my record. The teleporting magic ninja fight on
On a
flaming
dirigible?
pirate dirigible in a hurricane.
That's good stuff.
The thing is, I use exclamation points all the time if they're appropriate. I don't see why not. And
Again, it comes down to why are you telling people to not use a tool in their tool chest?
well, it's a funny thing 'cause people are like, well, it should be conveyed by the context. Yeah, hence the exclamation point.
Yeah, that's literally why it was invented, folks.
Exactly, that's what it's there. It's an exclamation because usually someone is somebody's on fire, or they're under fire, And so I use that all the time. I have no problem with that. I think they work.
Well, and one of the other things that I think that people can do a little bit better, and this will help with your dialogue, and that's doing a little work beforehand, and that's setting the scene appropriately. Because if you're just throwing people into random dialogue and there's no tags and stuff, it's hard to know what's going on. But if you set the stage appropriately, so you've basically said, okay, we know who the characters are, we know what the situation is. We'll just use an action scene just as an example. We know the characters that are involved. We know it's a tense situation because action's coming. People are drawing guns. They're checking, they're checking their ammo and stuff, or they're hunkering down behind a wall and they're giving each other nervous looks. You've set the stage so that you already know more or less what emotions people are going to be doing. You know who's there. You know more or less what's coming, and so you don't have to spend all this time in the middle of dialogue being exchanged, then dropping in a paragraph of exposition to explain everything that happens.
Yeah. We'll talk about this too when we get into action, because action sequences are some of the best time to have dialogue. They really are. And it's usually...
Oh, I love writing dialogue during action scenes.
It's usually tense, terse. It's also the best time to have good character development too, because you really get to know people. People always think of action as like a separate thing, but it's not.
No.
And dialogue is the same way. Dialogue occurs in all sorts of different situations and different contexts. Like we were saying, using the cues, the personal cues as to who did what to avoid the dialogue tags. Action scenes, that's super easy because someone can shout some instructions and then Bob ran to cover, or somebody else can say something as he reloaded, or whatever it may be.
Or, I mean, you learn pretty quickly that so-and-so's a coward because as the orders are being shouted, he's there just covering his head, trembling the whole time.
Yeah.
Like there's so much good potential character development, setting development, good dialogue use, all within an action scene.
Totally. It's interesting too, and this is another chance to differentiate how everybody sounds. We mentioned this a little bit, but a huge part of dialogue is giving characters their own organic voice that feels like a person. There are some very popular writers out there that I actually hate their dialogue because to me everybody sounds the same. They all sound the same. They all have the same sense of humor. They all like the same things, dislike the same things.
It's just the author projecting himself onto the book.
Yeah, I have a really, really hard time enjoying those because I usually, within a couple seconds of reading them, I'm usually picking at them, thinking, I would change this, I would change this, I would change this. And differentiating voices is one of the most important things you can do, and it's also one of the hardest for people to notice unless they really know what they're doing.
Now, every now and then, Larry and I give you some challenges or some exercises that you can kind of do to maybe kind of work your way through some of this. And what I think would be an interesting one for this, Larry, is to just have a scene with 2 or 3 people. Doesn't matter who they are. In the beginning, doesn't matter who they are. Just write some dialogue back and forth. Maybe it's just a thought exercise of you chatting about top ramen with your significant other. Doesn't matter. And then, put the dialogue tags in, but then start stripping them out and figuring out what do I need to add to this scene to make sure people know who is talking.
Yeah.
What kind of character traits. And then read it out loud.
Oh, that's a huge one. Reading it out loud is huge. I totally recommend that. I do that a lot.
Read it out loud. You will be shocked at how much better your dialogue will become. It's even in this little sample scene that you write. I mean, this thing only has to be a couple hundred words. You'll be shocked how much better your dialogue will be when you start reading it and trying to figure out inflection and stuff.
Well, one of the most important things your alpha readers are going to do is they're going to tell you whenever they're... I got this from Orson Scott Card, is when you're looking for them to tell you when they're bored or when they're confused. And the lack of dialogue tags is when they're confused. If there's like 3 or 4 lines of dialogue and someone's like, I don't know who said this, that's huge. I know I really screwed up, and there's one book in particular where, I won't say which one it is, that I wrote, and the narrator of the audiobook used the wrong voice for a long line of dialogue, which tells me that I failed in conveying who said that. Now, no one else is going to listen to that and realize it's wrong because it actually makes sense, I guess, in context for either.
Everyone's looking for it now.
Yeah, well, I still feel bad about it. Every time I hear it, I'm like, gosh darn it.
Except that's not the word he said.
That's not.
Said Larry. All right. So that's it for us today. Thank you again for joining us today on the Writer Dojo. And we look forward to talking with you next time. Thank you so much. Take it easy.
Writer Dojo is Steve Diamond and Larry Correa. Produced by Jack Wilder and Baron Hair Studios. Theme song, Word Mercenaries, by Craig Nilo. New episodes come out every Wednesday wherever you stream your content. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can help support us by going to anchor.fm/WriterDojo, by leaving us a 5-star rating or review, and by helping to spread the word. All questions and comments can be emailed to questions@writerdojo.com.
Ye lassie ne'er can do it.